Number 9. Berlin Olympic Village. Germany won a bid to host the 1936 Summer Olympic Games shortly before the Nazis rose to power. Then, Chancellor Adolf Hitler saw it as the perfect opportunity to spread propaganda. As part of his plan to show off what he saw as Germany's superiority over other countries, he oversaw the construction of a luxurious Olympic village in Wustermark, just outside Berlin. Hitler called for the site to be designed based on the concept of a peaceful village. This is laughable, considering the atrocities he would commit starting just a few years later. All along, his intention was to eventually use the site for the German army. The soon-to-be dictator's Olympic Village provided 4,000 athletes with unusually upscale accommodations, including top-of-the-line training facilities, dorms, and a swimming pool. During World War II, the site served as a training camp and a hospital for the Nazis. Because I guess you can be trained to be evil. Then in 1945, the Red Army took it over and occupied it for nearly 50 years. They finally cleared out when communism fell in the early 90s, prompting them to abruptly abandon the site. The village fell into ruins and went largely unnoticed, or perhaps ignored, by the locals, attracting just a handful of tourists every year. As of 2019, plans were underway to convert some of the buildings into apartments and townhouses for Berlin's burgeoning population. Number 8. Soviet Mine. In Russia's Ural Mountains, there's an abandoned mine that was hastily built during World War II when the Soviet military became desperate for natural resources. It was abandoned when the war ended, resulting in a lesser need for the minerals that the facility produced. The disused mine is still there today, but exploring it is dangerous. Given its quick construction and age, its structural integrity is questionable. The site is flooded with groundwater and filled with fallen rocks. Entering comes not only with the risks of landslides and the mine collapsing, but of being exposed to dangerous gases like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. This didn't stop one man named Mikhail Mashanik from going in there and capturing some eerie photos to share with the world. In fact, he told the Daily Mail that the danger element is part of the thrill, and that it feels special to experience a place very few people have ever seen firsthand. Mashanik's images show rusting train tracks, cluttered debris, and a deep pit filled with water. Number 7. Battery 223. Along the Atlantic coast in Cape May County, New Jersey, there's a drab concrete structure that looks really out of place. The locals all know about it, but it tends to take visitors by surprise. It's known as Battery 223. The building functioned as a harbor defense battery for the U.S. Army's Fort Miles military installation during World War II. It was built in 1943 as part of a modernization program that saw the construction of fortifications along the east and west coasts. With 6-inch thick, 15.2 centimeter reinforced concrete walls and a blast-proof roof, the battery was designed to withstand direct hits from battleships and aircraft. The structure was concealed by sand and earth and was equipped with 6-inch, 15.2 centimeter guns that had a 9-mile, 14.5-kilometer range. Fortunately, those guns were never fired at an enemy. Battery 223 was decommissioned in 1944 as the war turned in favor of the Allies, and advancing technology rendered the fort obsolete. The Navy used it for radio communications for a brief period after 1958, and in 1962, it became part of Cape May Point State Park. The site looks a lot different now than it did 77 years ago. When the battery was built, it was roughly 900 feet, 274.3 meters from the shoreline. Today, it sits right up against the water, and it's no longer covered in dirt, although greenery still grows on the roof. Number 6. Wunsdorf Soviet Camp. Located 25 miles, 40 kilometers outside Berlin, Wunsdorf is a sprawling 60,000-acre, 24,281 hectares site that originally served as a shooting range for the Prussian army. During the 1930s, it became the headquarters of the Nazi Wehrmacht forces. From the outside, it just looked like a typical village. But Wunsdorf was a heavily fortified military stronghold. Disguised as ordinary homes, its buildings had walls up to 11 feet, 3.2 meters thick. The site consisted of several bomb-proof bunkers with 2.6-foot thick, 80-centimeter ceilings, as well as an underground communications center. After the Nazis left following their defeat in World War II, the Soviets moved in. The Red Army used Wunsdorf as its headquarters and repurposed the site as an East German military camp. At its peak, it housed 75,000 Soviet men, women, and children, 40,000 of whom were soldiers. Life at Wunsdorf was strict. Soldiers weren't allowed to take vacations or accept visits from friends and loved ones who lived off-site. But there were some perks to living there. Situated in the middle of the woods, this hidden community had schools, shops, a concert hall, pool, theater, and other luxury accommodations that were reserved for more high-ranking military members and their families. The last remaining Soviet soldiers fled Wunsdorf in 1994, a few years after the Iron Curtain fell. They received just 12 hours notice that they had to pack up and leave. Some left their lunches half-eaten, while others abandoned their pets as they scrambled to vacate the premises. Several of the buildings at Wunsdorf are still standing today, seemingly untouched, as if they are frozen in time. A lone groundsman cares for them and strives to keep them in good condition, although time and the elements have taken their toll on the structures. 2 statues of Vladimir Lenin still stand outside, and some of the buildings are filled with Cold War-era artwork. Others have been turned into residential apartments. Wunsdorf is one of the few abandoned Soviet sites throughout Germany that are open to the public, giving visitors a chance to reflect on a dark chapter of history that feels like it happened much longer ago than it actually did. Does dark history interest you? Would you ever visit this place? Let us know in the comments below, and if you are liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. The Wolves Lair. Wolfschanze, or the Wolves Lair, was one of Adolf Hitler's many headquarters near the Eastern Front. The top-secret site was built starting in 1941 in the middle of the Masurian woods of what is now Kętrzyn, Poland. Sadly, the thousands of prisoners who were forced to build the Wolves Lair were all sent to their deaths within 6 months of arriving, taking the secret of its existence to the grave. As the war dragged on longer than Hitler thought it would, he found himself spending more time at the Wolves Lair than originally planned. So he kept upgrading it, and it was never fully finished. The complex consisted of 80 buildings, many of which were camouflaged with flat roofs and artificial greenery. According to guidebooks, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 people were employed at the facility at any given time. Modern experts think this is a low estimate and that there may have been as many as 50,000 people working in and around the Wolves Lair. The site was of great strategic importance. In addition to being situated deep in the forest, it was near a collection of lakes that acted as a natural barrier to ground troops and was only accessible via a small airstrip and a single railway. Hitler spent over 800 days at the Wolves Lair between June of 1941 and November of 1944. It is here that the failed attempt on his life known as Operation Valkyrie took place. As the Red Army advanced on the site a few months later, Hitler fled. The Soviets received the order to blow up the complex, but many buildings were left partially standing. The site fell further into decay under the communist Polish government over the following decades. It's become a tourist site since the fall of communism during the 1990s. In recent years, there's been talk about possibly restoring the Wolves Lair, but many fear that it would turn into a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site rather than teach important lessons about not letting history repeat itself. Number 4. Monsell Forts. The Thames estuary in Great Britain is punctuated by a series of armed towers known as the Monsell Forts. These bizarre-looking structures were built in 1942 and used by the British Army and Royal Navy for anti-aircraft defense and to deter and report German air raids. The Navy forts had 7 floors and housed 120 soldiers each. They were built offshore before being sunk in place. Several groups of Army forts were also built, some of which were interconnected by walkways. They were built to look futuristic and were slightly different from the Navy structures. The Monsell Forts were decommissioned and abandoned during the 1950s. Several of them were occupied the following decade as the headquarters of various pirate radio stations. Many of the Monsell Forts still stand today, although their future remains uncertain as they fall further into disrepair. One of the surviving structures is the so-called Principality of Sealand, a self-proclaimed independent state that declared sovereignty in 1967. The British government doesn't recognize Sealand as a country, but the people who live there don't seem to be doing any harm, so the government just leaves them alone. Number 3. Amari Kawanami Shipyard. The Amari Kawanami Shipyard was built in 1851 on the Japanese island of Kyushu. During World War II, it functioned as a factory where different types of boats and munitions were built. It employed 2,500 workers at its peak. This is where the Japanese manufactured the infamous kaiten, or human torpedoes, that the Navy used for carrying out suicide missions against the Allies towards the end of the war. The Japanese had started considering this extreme option in 1943 as the war turned in favor of the Allies. In a last-ditch effort to help the Axis powers gain an upper hand, they developed several different suicide vehicles. Most of the Kaiten that the military designed never went into service though, and the ones that did caused far more deaths to the Japanese than they did to their enemies. The shipyard continued building and repairing ships after the war until it shut down in 1953. In 2011, it was demolished and turned into a public park. Number 2. Flak Towers. After the British Royal Air Force attacked Berlin in 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of large anti-aircraft towers in the cities of Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. Known as Flak Towers, these massive concrete structures defended against Allied attacks and doubled as air raid shelters that could hold up to 10,000 civilians and had room for a hospital ward. Hitler rushed the supplies in by train and they took just 6 months to build. Each tower consisted of a large tower for gun mounts and a smaller tower which functioned as a control and command center. Equipped with walls measuring up to 11 feet, 3.5 meters thick, the Flak Towers were incredibly resistant to any attacks. Their guns were capable of firing up to 8,000 rounds per minute, although only one type of gun housed inside the Flak Towers was capable of defending against heavy US and British Air Force bombers. The Nazis used the towers as some of their last holdouts in 1945 as the war drew to a close and the Red Army encroached on Berlin. They eventually ran out of supplies and surrendered. Most of the smaller towers were demolished or buried after the war, but destroying the larger ones was considered unfeasible after the Soviets had struggled to damage them during combat. Some of the Flak Towers that are left standing have been repurposed in various ways. One tower in Vienna contains an aquarium and a climbing wall, while another one in Germany is home to several nightclubs and businesses. Number 1. The Maginot Line. During the 1930s, France built a series of concrete fortifications known as the Maginot Line along the country's borders with Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It was meant to prevent the Germans from invading by forcing them to go around the 280-mile-long, 450-kilometer line of structures and through what seemed like impenetrable forest. Fortified with reinforced concrete and 55 million tons of steel, the Maginot Line consisted of fortresses, underground bunkers, gun batteries, and minefields. It was impervious to almost any kind of attack, including artillery fire and poison gas. But the Maginot Line was a huge failure, despite being incredibly well built. During the planning stages, its designers looked to past wars rather than considering up-and-coming technology. When it came time for Hitler's forces to get past the Maginot Line, they barreled through the Ardennes forest using tanks. Their ability to do this proved detrimental to the enemy. The Germans surrounded the French and their British allies and pushed them back toward the coast. Then, the Nazis captured the Maginot Line and took 500,000 prisoners. The French reoccupied the Maginot Line after the war, but it was ultimately abandoned in 1966. Parts of it were auctioned off while others were left to rot. One section of the installation remained in use by the French military into the 1990s, but was deserted after the Soviet Union fell and there was no longer a perceived need for it. Today, sections of the fortification are used as wine cellars, a mushroom farm, and a disco. Number 10. Yulin Naval Base. Yulin Naval Base is a large-scale underground naval base built into a mountain along the southern coast of China's Hainan Island. It has drawn the attention of several intelligence agencies throughout the world. It's believed to be the country's most strategically important naval base in the South China Sea and can hold up to 20 nuclear submarines. Experts think that it may even be big enough to house aircraft carriers. Yulin Naval Base first appeared in photos that the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, captured in 2008. A satellite image from last year shows what looks like a Shane-class submarine entering the base, proving that it's indeed an active military site. In addition to storing watercraft, the site is home to several administrative buildings for military commanders. Construction on the base started in the year 2000, and work is still going on today. Photographic evidence from over the years shows that China has invested major time and effort into establishing the base, presumably to assert its dominance throughout the South China Sea. As a major trade waterway, the South China Sea is at the center of numerous territorial disputes between China and other countries. Yulin Naval Base is just one of several military outposts that have popped up in the region in recent years, as China stands firm on its strange claim of the entire sea and prepares to defend its position if necessary. Number 9. SFRY Marine Tunnels. on the remote Croatian island of Vis in the Adriatic Sea. In a region that was once part of Yugoslavia, there's a collection of dark, eerie submarine tunnels dating back to World War II. Recognizing the island's strategic importance for fighting the Nazis, Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito began implementing military installations throughout Vis. His creations included a sprawling network of underground tunnels spanning 12 miles, 19 kilometers. They were known as the SFRY tunnels. The complex included a submarine base, bunkers, and more. After World War II, the island became the Yugoslavian military's central base. It retained its importance for a period of communism that lasted for 50 years. Throughout this time, the tunnels occasionally served as hiding places for the military. The island's 3,600 residents were watched closely, and their movement was very restricted. They were outright banned from going to numerous places that they had once been free to enjoy. Vis was abruptly abandoned when Croatia gained its independence in 1991. This came as great news to locals who had been long campaigning to open the island up to tourists. Since then, civilians have repurposed some of the deserted structures into wine cellars and for other uses, but many remain abandoned. Number 8. Olavsvrn. During the Cold War, the Norwegian government decided that it was a good idea to establish a top-secret naval base north of the Arctic Circle. The facility was carved into a mountain outside the city of Tremoso and known as Olavsvrn. The structure is massive and secure, with a 3,000-foot-long tunnel leading to the entrance. It contained housing, workshops, offices, ammunition depots, and a dry dock, which had enough room for storing 6 submarines. There are also several dry docks that could accommodate larger ships. The complex functioned as a Norwegian Royal Navy base from 1967 until 2002, when it lost its official military status. It remained in use until 2009, when it was closed down for good following the restructuring of the Norwegian Navy. Russian entities with connections to a state-owned company rented out the site for some time. This concerned experts, who suspected the Russians of carrying out secret military operations there. A Norwegian company with a reputation for cooperating with the country's government became the major shareholder of the property 2 years ago, putting an end to whatever the Russians were doing at the site. Earlier this year, military units from Norwegian's allied countries, including the Dutch Marines, began using the base. Number 7. Hara Submarine Base. During the 1950s, the Soviet military built a top-secret submarine base on the Juminda Peninsula in Estonia, near the capital of Tallinn. After forcibly relocating some of the remote area's indigenous residents, the USSR constructed the sprawling site using locally sourced stones from nearby villages. The base is positioned 47 miles, 75 kilometers across the Gulf of Finland, from the Finnish capital of Helsinki. It was one of the few Soviet facilities that carried out submarine demagnetization, or degaussing, procedures. In 1989, after decades of laboring under the Soviets, Estonians came together in a peaceful protest to dismantle the facility. This was one of many events throughout the Soviet Union that symbolized its impending collapse. The Russians finally left the base in 1991. Today, the graffiti-covered base is part of Lahima National Park. The buildings have been gutted, but the concrete foundations remain. Roughly 10% of the base is connected to the mainland, and a boat is needed to access the rest. The site is popular among urban explorers, who can expect to encounter a sign warning them to enter at their own risk, and that they accept full responsibility in the event of an accident. Do you like urban exploring? Would you visit this site? Let us know in the comments below, and if you are liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Balaklava Submarine Base, Object 825. As Cold War tensions grew between the Soviet Union and the US after World War II, the two countries engaged in a frenzied arms race in a bid for military superiority. In the meantime, these superpowers prepared for possible attacks by establishing ultra-secure, heavily fortified military bases. The USSR constructed one such facility known as Object 825 on the Crimean Peninsula in the small oceanside town of Balaklava, which has functioned as a Russian military port for hundreds of years. It was built underground as a naval installation in 1957. The Cold War-era base was invisible from the open sea, affording it ample protection from prying enemies. It took 4 years to complete the structure. Builders blasted away rock to create a 2,000-foot long, 610 meters, tunnel that connects different sections of the interior. Object 825 was designed to both withstand an American nuclear attack and to respond to it effectively. It also served as a repair center for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet of submarines. The site was stocked with enough food, water, and other provisions for its 1,500-person staff to survive for a month in the event of a nuclear strike. For maximum security, a large set of doors and a strong concrete reinforced gate blocked each section of the base. Object 825 closed down in 1993 after the Soviet Union fell. In 2000, it fell into the hands of the Ukrainian Navy. By then, the site had been significantly looted and damaged, with all its metal having been removed for scrap. It became a museum in 2003. Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and is reportedly considering the possibility of restoring the submarine base for military use. Number 5. SaintNazer Submarine Base. During World War II, the Nazis built 5 large fortified submarine bases, called U-boat pens, along the Atlantic front. One of them was located in the commune of SaintNazer in German-occupied France. SaintNazer was one of the largest Atlantic harbors in all of France, making it a desirable target for the Nazis. They moved in on the area in 1940 and immediately began using it for submarine operations. It was built over a 16-month span between 1941 and 1942. The U-boat pen at SaintNazer was designed to withstand British air raid bombs. Measuring 980 feet, 300 meters long, and 59 feet, 18 meters high, it was constructed from 17 million cubic feet of concrete, 480,000 meters cubed. Its roof was up to 31 feet, 9.6 meters thick. The colossal construction was so big, it even had room for working on the largest German battleships. In addition to storing and repairing ships and submarines, the facility had 62 workshops, 150 officers, 92 dormitories, 4 kitchens, 2 electrical plants, a restaurant, and a hospital. It could house hundreds of men at any given time. On March 28, 1942, the British Royal Navy launched an amphibious attack against the base in a mission codenamed Operation Chariot. They blew up the dry dock, which remained out of commission for the rest of the war. The British won, but at the immense cost of hundreds of men dying and being taken prisoner. The site sat abandoned for a number of years before it was repurposed and opened to the public. Today, it contains a few museums, a nightclub, a cafe, an art exhibit, and more. Number 4. Horse Sand Fort. A rusting circular building known as Horse Sand Fort sits in the water off the English port town of Portsmouth. It was built between 1865 and 1880 as one of 4 structures known as the Palmerston Forts, which were put in place in response to the threat of a seaborne invasion from France. Measuring 200 feet, 61 meters in diameter, the armor-plated building consists of 2 floors and a basement. During the late 19th century, the outside was painted with a black and white checkered pattern as a form of razzle-dazzle camouflage, which was meant to confuse any enemies when it came to calculating a structure's dimensions, position, and/or distance. The wacky pattern was ultimately covered up, and when World War II came, the British military built extensive submarine defenses around the fort. Large concrete blocks were laid on the seafloor from the shore to the building, leaving just a small space for vessels to pass through. Both the fort and the barrier remain in place today because they've been deemed too costly to demolish. Business group Clarion Co. LLP bought Horse Sand Fort and a few others in 2012 with plans to convert it into a museum and open it to the public by 2016. This never happened, and as of last year, Horse Sand Fort was back on the market. It was reportedly sold just recently to an unnamed buyer whose identity and plans for it remain a mystery. Do you have any ideas on who bought it and what they want to do with it? Let us know in the comments below. Number 3. Alima Island. Italy's fascist regime occupied the Greek Dodecanese Islands from 1912 to 1943. The Kingdom of Italy's navy, known as the Regia Marina, used Alima Island as a military outpost complete with a submarine base. But during World War II, the Nazis began to question the Italians' loyalty. They decided that they wanted Alima and its surrounding islands all for themselves. In what became known as the Battle of Leiros, German forces took thousands of Italians as prisoners, executing many of them on the spot. The Nazis were quick to make themselves at home in the Dodecanese Islands, including at the base on Alima. 7 British commandos attacked the harbor the following year in an attempt to destroy German submarines. They were quickly captured. 6 of the men were executed, and numerous citizens were deported from the island for trying to help the commandos. Eventually, the last remaining family left Alima for better opportunities elsewhere. No one has lived there since the 1960s, and the deserted village was declared a protected settlement in 1987. The military buildings still stand though, serving as an eerie time capsule of a dark chapter in the world's history. Some of the structures are riddled with bullet holes, while others lie in ruins with old furniture scattered throughout. World War II relics are strewn throughout the island. Graffiti left behind by German soldiers shows men drinking beer and receiving letters, landscapes from their homeland, and other scenes that might remind a man of his life before the war. Number 2. Secret Object Number 6. On the coast of Peter the Great Bay in Russia's Primory region, there's a mysterious, semicircular concrete structure known as the submarine shelter Pavlovsko. To the Soviets who built it, it was simply called Secret Object Number 6. Nobody knows exactly when construction began because the base was top secret. It was most likely built during the 1960s and functioned as a shelter for submarines in the event of a nuclear attack. It was built into a cliff rock, with the site consisting of a network of tunnels spanning 3 levels. If an emergency were to happen, submarines would enter through a 1,608-foot, 490 meters tunnel with 6-foot thick, 1.8 meters concrete walls. Another tunnel contained working and living spaces. The facility was never completed. As funds dried up during the 1980s, construction ground to a halt. Operations reached a standstill in 1991 with the advent of START 1, the first of a series of agreements between the Soviet Union and the US called the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. The treaty required the USSR to stop building underground maritime structures and to seal off the entrances to some of these bases. Just 4 short months later, the Soviet Union collapsed and the base was abandoned. Many of its tunnels remain sealed off to this day, and visitors aren't allowed because of the area's abnormally high radiation count. Number 1. Kraterny Submarine Base. Located off the Japanese coast in Russia's far east, Simushir Island is part of the volcanic Kuril Island archipelago. Nobody lives there now, but it was once home to the Soviet Union's Kraterny Naval Base. It was built during the Cold War era, with the site consisting of the military installation itself and a surrounding town. There were apartment buildings, shops, a school, a hospital, and more. The settlement's population peaked at around 3,000 people. Most of the people who lived there were Navy personnel and their families. A top-secret submarine base operated within the naval base between the late 70s and 1991. With a flooded caldera, the island was the perfect place for storing submarines. Little is known about what actually went on at the site due to the secrecy surrounding it. Kraterny is now a ghost town filled with dilapidated buildings. Faded Soviet artwork adorn the walls, books are scattered across floors, half-finished shoes await repairs, and rusting trucks sit eerily still. In the 30 years since its closure, nature has reclaimed the shell of a town. Overgrowth and animals have taken over the seemingly post-apocalyptic site, which otherwise stands frozen in time.
Number 9. A helmet in the Martian surface. Conspiracy theorists love to scour images of the Martian surface for objects that look man-made. In 2012, one pseudoscience fanatic claimed to have spotted a Nazi helmet and human remains in photos that were taken by NASA's Curiosity rover. In a bizarre video, YouTube user UFO Vidi cited the objects as evidence that the Nazis visited the Red Planet. At the time of posting, NASA hadn't yet commented on the matter, perhaps because they thought it was so ridiculous that it wasn't worth their time. Just a guess. Not all the video's viewers were convinced. Some commented that the items were probably just rocks. This is usually what NASA tells people whenever they think they see signs of humans having been on Mars, which is surprisingly often. Others took the claim seriously. One commenter pointed out that the helmet more closely resembled a French Adrian helmet rather than a Nazi headpiece. Another asked in a seemingly serious tone how the helmet would attach to a spacesuit. The alleged discovery came on the heels of another outlandish claim from conspiracy theorists who were convinced that they had spotted a set of ancient wheels on Mars. They perceive the objects as evidence that at one time, aliens used advanced transportation on the Red Planet. But these so-called truth seekers have largely failed to explain how life would survive on a planet without liquid waters, and where temperatures are known to plummet as low as minus 193 degrees Fahrenheit. Number 8. Humans turned Mars red. Earlier this year, an overly imaginative TikTok user who goes by the handle Crackhead Joe Dirt posted a video claiming that humans once lived on Mars, but made it unlivable due to nuclear war. The narrator went on to say that the war caused a nuclear winter to set in, giving the planet its famous red hue. Claiming that Mars isn't naturally red, Crackhead Joe Dirt explained that enough nuclear weapons were detonated to cause a thick layer of ash to overtake the atmosphere and block out the sunlight. As a result, the planet changed colors over the course of several million years. He also said that the people he believes once lived on Mars depleted it of its natural resources, including liquid water. Now, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm inclined to wonder just how credible someone who goes by the username Crackhead Joe Dirt is. Scientists believe that water may have flowed on Mars billions of years ago, before modern humans existed. Moreover, a recent study determined that Mars reached its current amount of water, or lack thereof, rather 3 billion years ago. At that time, the only human-like creatures on Earth were primitive hominids who walked on 2 legs, but were nowhere near as evolved as we are now. According to experts, the loss of water on Mars can be attributed to atmospheric escape or being absorbed into rocks where it may remain today. Additionally, they say that Mars is red because it's covered in iron oxide or rust rather than waste from nuclear fallout. So while Crackhead Joe Dirt's theory is entertaining, it doesn't exactly make sense. To most people, that is. Number 7. Mars hosted an ancient alien civilization. Our fascination with Mars began during the early 19th century, when telescopes improved and gave us a much better view of the red planet. Humanity's curiosity has only grown since then, and it'll probably grow even more in the future as space technology continues to advance and scientists work to realize their vision of sending astronauts there. Rovers like NASA's Curiosity and Perseverance have snapped some of the most detailed pictures of Mars to date. While being able to see the landscape up close is helping scientists learn more than ever about the red planet, it's also caused some strange results among the general population. Anyone can access these images, and many people read far too deeply into what they see, sparking widespread rumors of man-made objects or evidence of alien civilizations on the Martian surface. People also misinterpret scientific findings. Take, for example, California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who in 2017 asked planetary scientists to investigate the possibility of an alien society existing on Mars thousands of years ago. He peppered his pitch with references to recent discoveries of Mars possibly once being home to large bodies of water. In short, Rohrabacher had taken the findings to mean that the planet was once life-sustaining. During an inquiry on the matter, panelist and NASA scientist Ken Farley tried to explain that any water on Mars dried up billions of years ago. Researchers believe that the water either escaped from the atmosphere or was absorbed into the planet's rocks. Farley also pointed out that there's no evidence of aliens ever having lived on Mars. Rohrabacher asked Farley why he would rule out the possibility, and he responded by saying that it's highly unlikely. This is just one of many examples of people misconstruing scientific findings, none of which are meant to imply that Mars ever hosted complex life forms. Do you agree with Farley, or do you think it's possible that aliens lived on the red planet? Let me know in the comments below, but first, be sure to like and subscribe. Number 6. Elvis Presley is alive and well and on Mars. Scott C. Waring is well known in the pseudoscience world, and to the experts who are constantly having to dispel his far-fetched conspiracy theories. In 2015, the armchair scientist made news headlines for yet another of his many outrageous claims. While doing what he does best, overanalyzing photos of space bodies with what can only be copious amounts of free time, Waring spotted a so-called alien figure on the Martian surface. Then he noticed what looked like Elvis Presley's signature white bell-bottom jumpsuit. Of course, he took the idea and ran with it instead of considering that maybe this was a classic case of someone interpreting a naturally occurring object as human-related. The tendency to do this is much like how we often look up at the sky and liken the shapes of clouds to man-made objects, except when we do this with clouds, we're aware that we're perceiving them in a certain way and that there's no deeper story behind what we're seeing. But when it comes to rocks on Mars, people cling to the idea that something that looks man-made really could be. Waring's claim of seeing Elvis alive and well on the Red Planet is just one of many examples of this, as you'll learn throughout today's video. Number 5. Mars is the same size as the full moon. In 2003, an email titled Mars Spectacular began circulating throughout the World Wide Web. At the time, Mars was due to approach the Earth at a historically close distance, and the email's original writer probably meant well, but the information they provided got wildly misconstrued. The message explained that during the event, Mars would look as big as the full moon, but many readers interpreted the statement as meaning that Mars is the same size as the full moon, and they failed to realize that a telescope would be needed to achieve the visual effect. Moreover, the email pertained strictly to 2003, when the Red Planet was due to come closer to Earth than it had in 60,000 years. Yet every year since, like clockwork, the Mars Spectacular message has resurfaced. For example, out of 51 calls that the New York City's Hayden Planetarium received ahead of an expected total lunar eclipse in 2007, 48 were from people asking about the upcoming view of Mars. Experts concede that the original email is mostly accurate, but it falsely implies that Mars would not come as close to the Earth as it did during the 2003 event for another 60,000 years after. In fact, the red planet will approach at a similar distance much sooner than that, in 2287. The email also claims that Mars was the brightest object in the sky besides the moon, but Venus actually glowed brighter. Despite these errors, the confusion surrounding the Mars Spectacular message resulted mostly from people misunderstanding what they were reading, and setting the record straight has proven to be practically impossible. Number 4. The face on Mars. News headlines went wild in 1976 over an image of what looked like a gigantic human face protruding from the Martian surface. Scientists combated conspiracy theories from day one of the hype, claiming that the formation was no more than a pile of rocks that bear an uncanny resemblance to a face. According to experts, the photo's lights and shadows hit the rocks in just the right way, and that's all the explanation boiled down to. But this isn't very exciting, so of course, conspiracy theorists let their imaginations run wild. They denied that the site was natural, and many claimed that the formation is evidence of life on Mars. Some believers even argued that the face represents the remnants of buildings left behind by an ancient alien civilization. Both NASA and the European Space Agency took more detailed photos of the face and concluded, not surprisingly, that their original analysis is correct, that the face is nothing more than an optical illusion. Number 3. Scientists discovered organic compounds on Mars. Chief NASA scientist John Grotzinger didn't mean to convey the wrong message when he expressed his excitement about a discovery made by the Mars Curiosity rover that had yet to be announced. But people began speculating about what he could possibly mean, with many defaulting to the assumption that the rover had found complex organic compounds. In other words, basic building blocks of life. When Grotzinger described the discovery as one bound for the history books, he was referring to simple chlorinated organics. These are chemicals containing carbon and at least one chlorine atom. They were collected by Curiosity Sample Analysis at Mars Instrument, or SAM, but at the time, it was still unclear whether the compounds originated on Earth and were somehow brought to Mars, or if they were truly Martian. Grotzinger was taken aback by how his statement had caused so much confusion. He later said that the experience taught him a lesson about watching what he says in a world where people live at the pace of Instagram, perhaps implying the instant gratification we seek in today's society. At the same time, Grotzinger was pleased with how much interest the mission generated. Number 2. There's a gorilla on Mars. In 2016, British tabloids decided that it would be fun to get readers worked up by featuring a photo of an alleged gorilla on Mars. Captured by NASA's Curiosity rover in 2004, the image drew little attention when the agency first published it, but then it appeared in a YouTube video made by someone known only as Mr. Enigma. The video inspired far-fetched headlines across mainstream media, adding the so-called gorilla to a growing list of animals that conspiracy theorists believe they've identified in photos of the Martian landscape. Pseudoscience enthusiasts reportedly scoured the internet for hours searching for an earthly species that they could correlate with the extraterrestrial primate. Some even pointed out that the photo also featured what looked like a camel, while others saw a mother bear and a cub in the image. It's a little outlandish to think that the animals we see here on Earth could also somehow exist in space, or that the species of our world would look anything like life on Mars, even if it did exist. But these beliefs have spread like wildfire over the years. In fact, in some of Mr. Enigma's other YouTube videos, he points out what he believes are numerous objects that are unique to planet Earth, including an octopus and an Egyptian statue. It's easy to believe that this content was created by someone who's out of touch with reality, or perhaps that it was made as a joke. But Mr. Enigma is just one of many people who have made similar claims, and who seem truly convicted in their belief that human-made objects and earthly life forms exist in outer space. In recent years, conspiracy theorists have reported seeing crabs, lizards, bears, rabbits, and other animals on the Martian surface, and as always, the scientific community stands by its claims that these are nothing more than rocks and other natural features of the landscape.
Number 1.
A thigh bone on the Martian surface. People who believe, or at least want to believe, that there was once life on Mars will cling to even the slightest perceived evidence of it. This was certainly the case in 2014, when NASA's Curiosity rover snapped pictures of what looked to many like a thigh bone. Conspiracy theorists and alien fanatics spotted the femur-like formation and immediately decided that it proves that the red planet once harbored life. Media outlets added to the hype by distributing the story to the masses to draw their own conclusions from. NASA tried to squash the rumor by releasing a statement that the object is just a rock shaped by natural processes like wind and water erosion. Surprisingly, most people seem to have accepted the explanation, and the buzz died down, at least for the moment. The story resurfaced last year, sparking a fresh round of claims that the evidence of past life on Mars had been found. Thankfully, unlike the first time, numerous news outlets were quick to dispel the rumor rather than appeal to shock value. Several articles reminded readers of NASA's statement from years earlier about the object being a rock. In doing so, they mentioned how Mars may have once been able to host living organisms, but even if they did, the creatures would have been microscopic. Simply put, there was never enough oxygen in the atmosphere for anything bigger to survive. Unfortunately, even the most logical explanation will fail to sway someone who wants to believe that there's more to the story. One way or another, they will find a way to make sense of their views, even when doing so comes at the expense of being irrational. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe for more crazy videos. Bye for now.